Imagine a prison built on a dried lakebed. Inside, inmates die under guard fire. Gangs rule corridors. A blackout hits California, and in the dark, a deadly uprising explodes. Welcome to Corcoran. If you've ever wondered what happens when the system breaks, stay with me. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I've got the rawest true crime stories you won't want to miss. It's February 1988 when the first wave of inmates arrive at the newly opened facility that would become one of America's most infamous prisons, Corcoran State Prison in Kings County, California. Built on what had once been Tulare Lake, the ground itself seems haunted by what will occur above it. From day one, the scale and ambition were large. This was to house level 4 offenders, the most dangerous in the system, under heavy security. But beneath the cold steel and razor wire there was a different truth. A system creaking under its own weight, filled with inmates who had nothing left to lose. Inside those early years, tensions were running high. The prison's design, its culture, the staffing, all combined to form a volatile mix. By the mid-1990s, insiders and investigative journalists would label Corcoran as the most troubled of the 32 state prisons. In 1996, the Los Angeles Times reported that guards at Corcoran had shot and killed more inmates than any other prison in the country during its first 8 years. The phrase Gladiator Days began to circulate, accounts of organized inmate combat sessions, allegedly coerced by guards, that ended in gunfire. But beyond the sensational headlines were the real lives inside. Men locked away, gangs already entrenched, survival becoming the primary job. The facility houses a security housing unit, SHU, protective housing and general population, all intermingled in ways that would test the boundaries of what even hardened corrections officials thought possible. In those early years, inmates arriving at Corcoran would soon learn that the name meant something. It meant level 4. It meant worst of the worst. It meant you might never see the outside again. It also meant you were entering a world where power wasn't held by the state, but by those willing to fight and die for it. And fight they did. In Section A of the prison, the general population cells were not safe havens but pressure cookers. Factions formed. Racial lines, gang lines, survival lines. Among them rose the shadow powers of the prison gangs that already held sway across California's correctional system. According to scholars, these gangs did not simply emerge randomly, they were shaped by institutional choices, staff actions, and the very layout of the prison system. Within a few years, Corcoran cell blocks would host men who back on the streets would be considered kingpins, but inside the walls they were pawns and predators all at once. Among them were those affiliated with the notorious Mexican Mafia, LAIM, and other prison gang networks. The prison's profile rose not only for the inmates but for the astonishing levels of violence and systemic failure. Cases of brutality, inmate assault, and alleged guard misconduct. By the mid-1990s the facility would be spotlighted on national television. A 1997 episode of 60 Minutes interrogated the death of an inmate in 1994, the federal investigation that followed, and the extraordinary number of shootings. If Corcoran State Prison had a map, the official one wouldn't tell you anything about how power actually worked inside. On paper you had the housing units, the SHU, the yards, the chow hall, medical. But beneath that sterile blueprint, there was a second layout, the invisible kingdoms run by California's most brutal and influential prison gangs. Every inmate knew this map. Every guard, whether they admitted it or not, felt its weight. By the early 1990s, Corcoran had become one of the most densely gang-saturated prisons in the state. This wasn't random. The California Department of Corrections housed the most violent and influential gang members in a handful of level 4 prisons, and Corcoran was a top destination. That decision would shape everything: the culture, the violence, the alliances, the terror. Inside, 3 main factions dominated the ecosystem. The Mexican Mafia, LAIM. Their influence reached far beyond the prison walls. When an inmate affiliated with LAIM walked into Corcoran, it was like a general arriving to a battlefield. Their reach extended through taxation, protection rackets, and orders that could be passed with nothing more than a gesture or coded message. Their authority was absolute, and defying them was equivalent to a death sentence. Nuestra familia, their lifelong rivals. Just the mere rumor of placing a LAIM member and an NF member in the same yard was enough to trigger violence. But in Corcoran it wasn't rumor, it was reality. Regularly. The administration's decision to house enemies within proximity would become one of the most controversial decisions in California's correctional history. The Aryan Brotherhood and rival white gangs. Small in number but disproportionately violent. Many of Corcoran's deadliest assaults bore their fingerprints. They ran tight militaristic networks and their contracts, both inside and outside prison, were carried out with chilling precision. In the general population units, you could see these rivalisms carved into the walls, etched into homemade tattoos, whispered in the showers and broadcast through violent clashes. An inmate's race wasn't just an identity, it was a survival strategy. You didn't choose your side chose you the moment you entered the building. To a newcomer, the first lesson was simple. You never walk alone in Corcoran. Every step, every meal, every yard session was dictated by gang structure. And behind this turbulent ecosystem, guards patrolled with a constant sense of dread. They weren't just watching inmates, they were watching an ongoing Cold War play out in real time. Sometimes inmates controlled the flow so effectively that guards relied on them to keep order. Other times, the staff's attempts to intervene only poured gasoline on the fire. Rumors circulated among inmates about unofficial arrangements. Moments when guards would place rival gang members together intentionally, knowing violence would erupt. Some said it was incompetence. Others claimed it was a strategy, let enemies thin each other out. Those whispers would eventually explode into public scandal by the late 1990s. But we'll get to that. Inside Corcoran, an inmate didn't just fear death, he accepted it as part of the schedule. A man could be drinking his morning coffee, hear the metal yard gate buzz open, and know instantly a riot was about to happen. You could feel it, a tension in the air, a quiet that lasted a little too long, the way inmates stood a little farther apart or a little too close. And in this powder keg, the most dangerous place of all wasn't the yard. It was the SHU, the Security Housing Unit. A place where California isolated the worst of the worst, and where some of the most powerful inmates in the state lived in near-permanent lockdown. But isolation didn't stop the gangs. It sharpened them. Orders still flowed from the SHU like water from a faucet. Coded letters, hidden messages, corrupt channels, released on the yard like commandments. Corcoran wasn't a prison, it was an ecosystem of shadow governments. But these kingdoms within the walls weren't the only threat. A bigger story was building. The rise of the Gladiator rumors, the shootings, and the federal investigations that would put Corcoran on national television. The violence was escalating and everyone inside knew something was coming, something explosive. Before long, the outside world would find out. By the early 1990s, the violence inside Corcoran wasn't just frequent, it was predictable. Inmates would whisper about it long before it happened, like men discussing the weather. "It's gonna rain in 4B tomorrow," someone might say. Rain didn't mean water. It meant blood. And slowly, quietly, a rumor began spreading through the yards and tiers. The fights aren't random. Someone's setting them up. At first, inmates dismissed it as paranoia. In prison, people blamed the system for everything, losing privileges, fights, disciplinary write-ups. But then patterns emerged. Too many coincidental pairings. Too many rival gang members released into the same yard section within seconds of each other. Too many shootings. Guards were armed with Mini-14 rifles on elevated catwalks above the yard. Standard protocol: if a fight broke out and verbal commands didn't stop it, they fired warning shots. If the fight continued, they were authorized to aim for the legs. But inside Corcoran, gunfire wasn't the exception, it was baked into yard time. Over the prison's first 8 years, officers shot more inmates at Corcoran than at all other California prisons combined. That statistic alone would eventually ignite national outrage, but inside the walls it was just part of the daily soundtrack. The inmates called these events gladiator fights. To them, it felt like someone up top was pulling strings, controlling who went out when, who got placed together, which enemies would clash. Some believed it was a twisted attempt at crowd control. Others thought certain guards simply enjoyed the adrenaline, or wanted to rack up justified shootings to look effective. But to the men who lived through it, none of that mattered. What mattered was this: if you stepped on that yard with the wrong person, you were either fighting or dying. There was no middle option. One former inmate later told investigators he knew the minute a cell door opened whether he was walking into a setup. The signs were always there: rival gang members pacing too close to the gate, a guard watching a little too intensely, a yard that felt, you could feel it in your skin, like a trap. And then it happened. A buzzer. The steel door slams open. 2 men step out. A moment of eye contact. Then chaos. Some men fought because they wanted to. Some fought because their gang demanded it. But many fought simply because the alternative was worse. If you refused, if you backed down, you'd face your own people later. And inside Corcoran, your own people could be far more terrifying than your enemies. That's how the Gladiator Days took hold. Fists, makeshift blades, kicks, blood on concrete, all under the watch of armed staff above. The moment a fight dragged on too long, the crack of a rifle would echo across the yard. Bullets meant to hit legs sometimes hit higher. Sometimes men died. Sometimes men were permanently crippled. By the mid-1990s, word began leaking out. Letters to families. Rumors relayed through attorneys. A few brave staff members talking quietly to journalists. Pressure mounted, and eventually the federal government got involved. A 1994 shooting that left an inmate dead caught the attention of national media. More stories surfaced. Federal investigators began interviewing inmates, guards, administrators. And for the first time, the outside world began hearing phrases like orchestrated fights, intentional mixings, pattern of shootings. And yet, inside Corcoran, nothing slowed down. If anything, wounds deepened. Inmates felt like their lives were entertainment. Guards felt defensive, angry, convinced the violence was inevitable. Administrators tried to hold the line, insisting policies were followed. Federal investigators saw something else entirely. Meanwhile, something bigger was brewing, something that would take all that violence, all that tension, and magnify it tenfold. A statewide disaster was coming. A blackout that would plunge California into darkness. And inside Corcoran, darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was an opportunity. For revenge. For rebellion. And for power to shift in ways nobody saw coming. By the late 1990s, California's energy grid was teetering on the edge. Power companies were juggling shortages, political decisions, and infrastructure problems that stretched the system thin. Most people outside the walls barely noticed the early outages. A few flickers. A rolling blackout here and there. A few minutes without air conditioning or lights. Inside Corcoran State Prison, those few minutes meant something entirely different. Power wasn't just electricity, it was control. It ran the gates, the doors, the alarms, the cameras, the radios, the entire life support system of a maximum security prison. When the lights flickered in a normal building, people groaned. When they flickered at Corcoran, you could feel every inmate on the tier stop breathing. The first real blackout hit late in the afternoon. A dry, silent moment. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. And then, everything cut. No warning. No transition. Just darkness. For about 15 seconds, the whole prison was dead quiet. Not because inmates were scared, but because every man inside was listening. Listening for movement. Listening for opportunity. Listening for danger. Then the chaos started. Officers scrambled to their flashlights. Radios crackled with half-complete messages. Emergency generators kicked in, but only for essential areas. The rest of the prison stayed underpowered, underlit, and unbelievably tense. Doors didn't open. Yard gates froze. The electronic locks stayed sealed in whatever position they were in at the moment the lights died. If a man was inside a shower when the blackout hit, he stayed in the shower. If he was in the dayroom, he stayed in the dayroom. If he was in a hallway, God help him. Every inmate knew blackouts were chances, rare, unpredictable, and powerful. Some used them to pass things quietly. Some to attack with surprise. Some just to observe, to see how guards reacted and where their weaknesses were. And the guards knew it too. Officers closed ranks. They huddled around control booths, even when the booth itself wasn't functional. They whispered quick plans back and forth, trying not to sound panicked. Corcoran had seen riots, stabbings, lockdowns, but blackouts were different. They erased the one thing staff had over inmates: visibility. Even with auxiliary lights running, entire sections were left dim and shadowed. The tiers felt longer, the cells felt deeper, and the silence between noises felt louder. But that first blackout wasn't the one that changed history. It was the second. The second blackout lasted longer, much longer. And it struck at the worst possible time. Just before shift change, when staff numbers were in flux and movement was already happening across the prison. Officers were repositioning. Inmates were being escorted. Doors were cycling. Lines were forming. And then, black. The whole prison froze mid-motion. A guard holding a cuff chain. An inmate halfway through a doorway. Another stepping out of a cell. A kitchen worker carrying trays. A tier officer holding keys. Every one of them caught in suspended animation. Then, slowly, the adrenaline kicked in. You could hear men whispering in the dark. You could hear metal scraping. You could hear someone laughing, always the most chilling sound in a blackout. Rumors say one housing unit plunged into pitch darkness for almost 20 minutes. The cameras were offline. The electronic doors stayed closed. The only thing preventing total chaos were the manual locks, old-school metal bars that required physical keys to open. Inmates in the SHU started shouting down their tiers. Some were giving orders. Some were demanding information. Some were threatening violence as soon as the power returned. But here's where things took a dangerous turn. Someone used the blackout to settle a score. When the lights eventually flickered back on, officers found an inmate bleeding against the railing on the upper tier. He had been stabbed multiple times with a weapon nobody could identify. Some said it was plastic. Others said it was metal. Others said it was something improvised from a part of the building itself. What mattered wasn't the weapon. What mattered was how it happened in darkness. The investigation that followed exposed something chilling. Inmates had been preparing for a blackout long before one actually happened. They had mapped guard routines, timed the generator delays, counted how long each housing section stayed dark before emergency power kicked in. In other words, the blackout wasn't the cause of the violence. It was the opportunity. And something bigger was about to hit, a statewide energy crisis that would plunge sections of California into repeated rolling blackouts. Corcoran, already a powder keg, was about to become something far worse. Because one of those blackouts wouldn't be short. It wouldn't be controlled. It wouldn't be routine. It would be the blackout that shook the entire state, the one that would test every inmate, every guard, every gang, and every rumor that had ever circulated inside those walls. And when that night hit, Corcoran turned into a battlefield. The day started like any other inside Corcoran. Heat baking the yard. Dust drifting off the old Tulare Lake basin. Officers sweating under their gear. Inmates pacing slow circles, tension simmering from 100 silent feuds. But beneath all that, something strange was already happening across California. The energy grid was unstable, again. In most cities, residents were annoyed, internet blinking out, stores going dark for 10 minutes at a time. But inside Corcoran State Prison, staff were getting jittery. The warden had already issued internal memos warning of possible extended outages. Officers didn't like the sound of that. Extended outages meant extended blindness. Still, nobody inside expected what came next. The first warning. Just before sunset, the lights on Yard 3A flickered. Only for a second. Enough for men to stop mid-step, look up, and exchange glances. A guard on the tower radioed control. "You see that?" Static. Then a short response. "We're checking it." Nothing else. Inside the housing units, guys joked that the lights were tired. Some laughed it off, others didn't. Corcoran had taught them that nothing as simple as a flicker was ever just a flicker. The tension shifted, small, subtle, but real. Guards tightened their stance. Inmates started moving with more caution, watching faces around them. Something was coming. 8:17 p.m., the collapse. At exactly 8:17 p.m., the prison's entire electrical grid failed. Not a flicker. Not a partial outage. A total, complete, catastrophic shutdown. Everything went black. The air conditioning stopped. The hum of cameras went silent. Magnetic locks disengaged. Control panels died. Radio sputtered into static. And then the sound hit, the single most unnerving noise inside any maximum security prison. Hundreds of inmates screaming, laughing, shouting, banging all at once. The walls vibrated with it. Officers on the tiers froze. Guards instinctively reached for flashlights, but some of the flashlights didn't turn on. Others flickered weakly. Batteries were low. Nobody had expected a full grid collapse. In the SHU, men began kicking their doors. In general population, inmates began moving in the dark, speaking in codes only their own gangs understood. It was pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't see your own hand, where every sound becomes a threat. This was exactly the moment certain inmates had been preparing for. The generators fail. Emergency generators were supposed to kick in within 10 seconds. That was protocol. 10 seconds. Officers counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Nothing. They didn't turn on. The blackout wasn't normal. It wasn't routine. It wasn't manageable. Something in the grid outside Corcoran, some cascading failure, had knocked out the generators too. Rumors would later float around that backup systems in the valley were overwhelmed, that the rolling blackouts hit at the exact moment Corcoran's grid was switching phases. Inside the prison, nobody cared about the explanation. All they knew was, Corcoran was now a locked box full of rival armies and all the lights were off. The first assault. In Housing 4B, an officer named Delgado felt someone brush past him in the dark. He couldn't see who it was. He grabbed for a sleeve. Nothing. He reached for his radio. Dead. He shouted a warning, drowned out by the noise. 2 seconds later, he heard the unmistakable sound of bodies crashing into the floor. A fight had broken out. No one could see who was winning, who was bleeding, or even how many were involved. Officers swung flashlights like clubs just to create space. Some inmates used the darkness to settle debts. Some hid. Some waited. Some listened for orders in Spanish, English, coded whistles, clicks, hand taps, all the languages of the gangs. The yard breach. On Yard 1, officers realized something terrifying. The blackout had frozen one of the exterior gates partially open. Not enough for an escape. Enough for movement. A line of inmates pushed through, not running, walking, disciplined, organized. They moved with purpose, sticking together like a unit. Officers knew immediately who they were dealing with. A crew under gang leadership. Which gang? It was too dark to tell. Colors and tattoos meant nothing in the shadows. One officer fired a warning shot into the air, or thought he did. Without cameras, without lights, and with radios dead, the sound echoed strangely across the yard, and nobody could confirm where the shot went. It only escalated the panic. Inmates ducked. Officers scrambled. The line of men disappeared into the dark corner of the yard, like shadows melting into deeper shadows. The moment the staff lost control. For the first time in Corcoran's history, officers acknowledged, silently, fearfully, that they no longer controlled the prison. Control belonged to whoever understood the dark best. And that wasn't staff. It wasn't administration. It wasn't policy. It was the gangs. The blackout had leveled the battlefield, erased surveillance, neutralized firearms, destroyed communication. Now power came down to one thing. Who was willing to move first? And someone did. At 8:41 p.m., 17 minutes into the blackout, the first inmate was found stabbed in Housing 3C. No one knew where the attacker went. No witnesses. No video. No sound but the man choking on his own blood. It was only the beginning. Because the blackout wasn't ending soon. Emergency crews outside the prison realized the problem spreading across California was bigger than expected. Whole sectors were collapsing. Calls to the prison weren't getting through. And inside Corcoran, the inmates weren't just reacting to the darkness. Some were using it, planning in it, and preparing to reshape the prison forever. The night wasn't even half over. The blackout had turned Corcoran into a fortress swallowed by shadows, but while officers scrambled to regain footing, another group was already operating with precision, the prison gangs. The darkness wasn't a setback for them, it was an equalizer. An advantage. A battlefield they'd been preparing for long before the lights went out. Inside the SHU, where the most influential gang shot callers were housed, the blackout hit differently. Men locked in concrete boxes suddenly became the loudest voices in the prison. Their shouts echoed down the tiers, bouncing between steel doors and narrow hallways until they almost harmonized into a single terrifying chorus. Every gang had a code for blackouts. Every code meant the same thing. Organize. These orders weren't random. They were strategies that had been built over years, sometimes decades, of surviving the California prison system. The ones yelling the loudest weren't random inmates. They were generals, architects of violence. Their voices commanded loyalty from hundreds of soldiers scattered across Corcoran. The officers knew this, and it terrified them. Lines of communication. With radios dead, phones useless, and electronic doors frozen, staff were suddenly operating in the same darkness inmates lived in every day. But the inmates had something guards didn't. Human communication networks. Whisper chains. Tier-to-tier shouts. Hand taps through walls. Coded knocks on vents. Scraped metal signals. A language born of isolation and necessity. While officers tried to regroup, inmates were already relaying messages across multiple units. Instructions were being passed with unbelievable speed. Some of the newer guards didn't recognize what was happening, but the seasoned officers did. They'd seen this before. Messages, one sergeant whispered in the dark. They're building messages. Once the networks formed, it was only a matter of time before the prison's entire inmate population was operating under synchronized orders. Orders designed to turn the blackout into an offensive. A calculated power grab. By 9:12 p.m., just under an hour into the blackout, a second stabbing was discovered on the upper tier of Housing 4A. The victim was a known associate of a rival gang. His hands were bound, his body slumped near the railing, his face swollen from repeated blows. But what chilled staff wasn't the stabbing. It was the precision. The attacker had known exactly where the man lived. Exactly when he'd be vulnerable. Exactly how to strike unseen. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't rage. This wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. The violence had motive, coordination, intent. The blackout hadn't created violence at Corcoran, it had simply removed obstacles. The officers retreat. With surveillance down, staff began consolidating into defensible clusters throughout the prison. Small groups of officers backed into control booths, dim hallways or corners where they could watch each other's backs. They weren't retreating out of fear, they were retreating out of survival. And the inmates noticed. In the dark, power wasn't about weapons. It wasn't about numbers. It was about confidence. When inmates sensed the guards losing visibility, losing positioning, losing initiative, they capitalized. In Housing 3B, an officer named Jensen tried to do a tear check with nothing but a flickering flashlight. Every few steps he had to slap the flashlight to keep it alive. He passed one cell and heard whispered laughter inside. He passed another and heard an inmate quietly scraping metal on concrete. A third cell. "We see you, boss," a voice whispered. He froze. Then the voice added, "You alone out here, huh?" He wasn't, not technically. Another officer was somewhere behind him, but with the blackness, the distance felt infinite. Jensen backed away, hands trembling, breathing shallow. He knew they weren't threatening him directly. Not yet. They were letting him know they had the advantage. Corcoran had flipped. The officers still wore the badges. But the inmates now owned the night. Gangs begin to reshape the prison. By 9:45 p.m., the blackout's second phase had begun. The power consolidation phase, the part no staff ever wanted to witness. In one unit, a group of men moved together silently, guiding their newest member to a corner of the day room. There, in dim emergency lighting, they pressed instructions into his palm, a folded piece of paper barely larger than a postage stamp, containing coded orders. In another unit, a higher-ranking inmate ordered two younger ones to control the tier. No shouting. Just calm instruction. Within minutes, those two men had positioned themselves on opposite ends of the walkway, listening for footsteps, intercepting messages, protecting their shot caller. Inside the SHU, a powerful gang member banged a series of codes on his cell door. The man 3 doors down repeated it. The man 7 doors down did the same. Across the entire section, the rhythm of metal knocks carried orders location to location. Outside the walls, California was drowning in its own blackout crisis. Inside the walls, Corcoran's underworld saw something else. A chance to redraw the map of power. To move pawns. To settle debts. To weaken rivals. To reshape who controlled which tiers, which yards, which privileges. The blackout had given them something they almost never had. Unrestricted time. And they weren't wasting a second of it. An ominous silence. Near 10 p.m. the prison changed again. The noise dropped. The shouting faded. The banging stopped. The whole facility fell into a thick, unnatural quiet. Officers everywhere stiffened in place. In Corcoran, silence was never peace. Silence was strategy. When the inmates got quiet, it meant one thing. They had finished organizing. And something big was about to happen. The guards didn't know what it was. The inmates did. Some were excited. Some terrified. Some praying. The prison sat in darkness, waiting. Because the blackout wasn't easing up. And the real nightmare hadn't even started yet. By the time the blackout passed the 2-hour mark, Corcoran had transformed from a prison into something closer to a war zone held together by fear, instinct, and thin strips of emergency lighting. Every officer knew one truth. When a prison goes quiet, something is happening that you do not want to discover late. But that silence didn't hit evenly. It started unit by unit like falling dominoes. First 3A went silent. Then 4B. Then 2C. Then the SHU. Within minutes, whole sections of Corcoran were locked into a deep, strategic hush. The kind that made the hair on a man's arms rise even in the sweltering heat. Officers leaned against walls, listening. Every breath sounded too loud. Every scrape of a shoe felt like a mistake. The silence was absolute. Until it wasn't. Somewhere deep in Housing 1A, an inmate began humming. Just humming. A low, steady note. A second voice joined. Then a third. Then a fourth. Soon, the quiet was filled with a faint, eerie harmony, dozens of men humming the same droning vibration. Some guards later said it reminded them of monks chanting. Others said it sounded like bees inside a metal hive. But every inmate knew what it was. It was a signal. A synchronizing cue. A way to unify men across tiers without raising suspicion. A way to say, "We're ready." The weak point emerges. In the administration office at the center of the facility, a skeleton crew gathered around a single battery-powered lamp. Maps covered the table. Not operational maps, political ones. Protocols. Contingency plans. Layers of procedures that assumed the one thing they no longer had: power. An older lieutenant named Rourke slammed a fist onto the table. "Our choke point's gone," he said. "What choke point?" a younger sergeant asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The central corridor," Rourke said. "The one we used during lockdowns. All the electronic gates in that hallway failed. We can't close it. And without that..." He didn't have to finish. Everyone understood. The central corridor was Corcoran's spine. It divided units, controlled movement, created natural barriers. With it open, the entire facility became one continuous artery. If inmates found a way out of their pods, even just a few cells, there would be nothing to stop them from moving deeper. It was the kind of vulnerability inmates could sense, like animals detecting blood in water. And the gangs knew exactly which direction to push. The dayroom gathering. In Housing 4A, the emergency lights flickered at just the right moment, long enough to cast a faint glow across the dayroom floor. What officers saw made their stomachs drop. A cluster of inmates standing together in a loose semicircle. Not fighting. Not yelling. Not moving frantically. Just standing, calm, coordinated, and waiting. In the center was a tall, older inmate with a shaved head, arms folded, face unreadable. A known shot caller. A man who had risen to authority through years of discipline, violence, and strategy. He didn't say a word when the lights hit him. He just looked at the officers, held their gaze, then looked away as if they didn't matter. When the lights cut out again, the group dissolved into the dark. The message was clear. They're not panicking. They're preparing. Staff realizes the worst. In the control booth above 3B, 2 officers scanned the tiers with handheld flashlights, trying to pinpoint movement. They saw nothing. No shadows moving. No hands reaching out of cells. No faces pressed to the bars. Nothing. "Where the hell are they?" one officer whispered. His partner swallowed. "They're in their cells," he said slowly. "Waiting." Waiting for what? He didn't answer. Because they both knew the truth. Power was coming back soon. Even in a statewide crisis, Corcoran's generators couldn't stay dead forever. And when the lights returned, visibility returned. Authority returned. Control returned. So if the inmates were planning something, anything, the window was closing fast. Whatever was going to happen had to happen before the lights returned. And that meant the silence wasn't peace. It was a countdown. The door that shouldn't have opened. At 10:37 p.m. in Housing 3C, a sound cut through the silence. Clack. Metal on metal. A heavy, unmistakable mechanical lock shifting. The kind of sound an officer knew instantly. And an inmate knew even faster. "What the hell was that?" one guard hissed. Another officer shined a flashlight down the tier. Then he saw it. A door. Not wide open, but slightly ajar. Just enough. A cell door. A door that had been closed before the blackout. A door that was not supposed to move without electronic authorization. There were only 2 possibilities. A mechanical failure caused by the blackout. Someone, somehow, opened it manually. Neither explanation was comforting. The officer stepped forward, then stopped. Inside the darkness of the open cell, 2 eyes stared back at him. Unblinking. Still. Watching. Then another pair appeared. Then another. More movement. 3 silhouettes. 4. 5. They weren't coming out. They were waiting inside the darkness of the room like a nest of predators ready to strike when the moment hit. The guards backed up slowly. "Get to the booth," one whispered. "Now." The first wave moves. At 10:41 p.m., the silence broke to pieces. A single inmate yelled a code. Another echoed it. Another repeated it down the hall. Then dozens of voices responded at once. A unified, coordinated roar. Not chaos. Not confusion. A command. A signal. A release. The first wave of inmates began to move. Not running. Not screaming. Not stumbling in fear. Moving with purpose. Moving with direction. Moving in the dark like men who had practiced this moment in their heads for years. And for the first time since the blackout began, Corcoran entered the point of no return. The uprising had officially begun. The moment the coded shout rippled through the prison, Corcoran exploded to life like a pressure cooker finally blowing its lid. The sound wasn't random, it was synchronized, unified, the kind of eruption that only happens when hundreds of men receive the same command at the same time. For hours they had whispered, waited, positioned themselves. Now they moved. The first breach didn't start in the yard. Not in the chow hall. Not in a dayroom. It started inside a single cell. The same cell officers had spotted moments earlier, The one cracked open just enough to look like an accident. But it wasn't an accident. It was a staging point. A launch pad. A pressure point in the prison's anatomy. When the uprising signal went out, the men inside that cell surged forward. Not chaotically. Not blindly. But like trained soldiers. A flashlight beam caught the first glint of movement. Bodies rushing low, tight, fast. Officers shouted commands they already knew wouldn't matter. They tried to slam the cell door shut manually, but the lock wasn't responding. The mechanical override was dead. The men burst out of the cell like wolves from a cave. The first officer took a hard hit to the ribs, staggered, and fell. Another went down trying to close distance. Someone in the dark yelled, "Man down! Man down!" But radios were still useless. The inmates didn't linger. They didn't stomp. They didn't gloat. They moved. Their objective wasn't the officers. It was the tier. Tier takeover. When inmates gain control of a tier in a level 4 prison, the entire facility is seconds from collapse. The tier is the artery, access to doors, stairs, showers, dayrooms, other cells. The breach teams split instantly. 2 men moved left, sweeping the walkway for guards. 3 moved right, checking for resistance. 1 headed straight to the end of the corridor where the mechanical key slots were located. He wasn't supposed to know those locks. No inmate was. But within seconds he began manipulating the mechanism. That simple movement, a hand twisting metal inside a dark panel, sent shockwaves through the officers watching. He knew the system. And if 1 inmate knew, more would. This was no spontaneous riot. This was a coordinated assault on infrastructure. The control booth under siege. Above the tier, inside the shadowed control booth, 2 officers watched the horror unfolding below. The booth was designed to be secure, bullet-resistant, a fortified perch controlling the entire housing unit. But tonight it was a coffin. The electronic panel controlling the cell doors was dead. The intercom was dead. The surveillance monitors were dead. All they had were a few flashlights, 2 shotguns, a handful of keys, and a view of a dark tier filling with movement. An officer named Ramos tried signaling neighboring units by banging the butt of his flashlight on the booth's metal frame. 3 long bangs. Pause. 3 more. The emergency code for assistance. Somewhere in the dark, he heard a faint echo of the same pattern. At least 1 other officer heard them. That was something. Not much, but something. Then came the moment they'd been dreading. Inmates began climbing the railing. One after another. Hands gripping steel. Bodies pulling up. Faces emerging out of the black like rising phantoms. They weren't trying to attack the booth, not yet. They were positioning themselves above it. On a normal night, no inmate would dare. In the dark, with power gone, the rules didn't apply. Ramos whispered under his breath. Jesus. The yards erupt. While the breach in 3C escalated, the chaos spilled outward. In Yard 2, men who had been lying low began moving toward the fences that separated racial groups during daylight hours. Those invisible lines didn't matter now. The gangs calling shots weren't preaching unity, they were executing strategy. The northern Hispanics formed a defensive ring. The southern Hispanics moved as a pack, scanning for rivals. Whites aligned along the wall under Aryan Brotherhood direction. Black inmates split into 2 distinct clusters, each following their own internal leadership. It wasn't a riot. It was battlefield positioning. Officers shouted for everyone to get down. Some inmates complied out of habit. Most didn't. A few stared at the guards with cold, unreadable expressions, the look of men weighing options in real time. And then the stabbing started. 2 inmates collided in the far corner, fast, brutal, silent. Another fight erupted 10 yards away. A third, fourth, and fifth went off in tight succession. Officers couldn't tell if these were planned hits or crimes of opportunity. But they had a sinking suspicion. It was all planned. Every attack. Every target. Every move. The blackout wasn't just chaos, it was cover for surgical removals. Across the prison, a pattern emerges. As more units reported movement, assaults, and breaches, by flashlight, by yelling, by running to other officers, a terrifying pattern became clear. Every major gang inside Corcoran was making a move at the same time. Not together. Not as allies. But simultaneously. Each was using the blackout to reposition, eliminate threats, fortify tiers, and seize whatever ground they could before the lights returned. This wasn't an escape attempt. It was a reorganization of power. And Corcoran, already one of the most violent prisons in America, was watching its internal map being redrawn in real time. SHU orders spill into the main line. Inside the SHU, The shot callers continued barking instructions through doors, pipes, vents. They were like generals running a war from underground bunkers. One voice, deep, commanding, echoed. "Green light him. Green light Unit 3. Another replied. "Handle business on the tier. Handle it." Officers tried yelling over them. It didn't matter. Their voices were swallowed by steel and darkness. Inmates listened to their own leaders, not the state. One guard later described it. It was like watching an army fight without ever seeing the generals. Officers begin the last stand. By 11 p.m., staff realized the unthinkable. They were losing the prison. Not entirely. Not hopelessly. But piece by piece. Units were falling out of command. Tiers were compromised. Gangs were solidifying positions. Inmates were moving with frightening coordination. And still, no lights. No power. No radios. No reinforcements. No control. In the admin hallway, Lieutenant Rourke looked at the skeleton crew gathered around him. "We have one option," he said. Everyone listened. "We push back before the lights come on. Because once that power flips on, every inmate in this place will know exactly where we are standing." He was right. In darkness, officers had anonymity. When power returned, they'd be outlined in bright white light, visible and exposed. There was no waiting it out. They had to move now. The blackout had entered its deadliest phase. The gangs had made their opening move. The officers were preparing their counterstrike. And the power was still nowhere near coming back. When the sun finally rose over the old Tulare Lake Basin, the prison yard looked like a battlefield, blood on the concrete, overturned food carts, shattered plastic, torn clothing drifting like flags of surrender. Teams of exhausted officers moved unit to unit, escorting inmates back into cells, assessing injuries and counting bodies. It would take hours before the full tally of what happened during those long, suffocating hours in the dark became clear. Some men survived the night by pure luck. Others by vicious instinct. A few never saw dawn at all. Corcoran State Prison had endured riots before. It had survived political pressure, lawsuits, federal investigations, and national media storms. But nothing in its history matched the scale, precision, and raw terror of that blackout. Because in those hours without power, the masks fell. The rules vanished. And the truth of the place was exposed. Corcoran wasn't run by concrete and steel. It wasn't controlled by towers or cameras. It wasn't safeguarded by policy. It was held together by a fragile balance. A balance that the darkness shattered. The blackout didn't create monsters. It revealed them. On both sides of the bars. When the power finally returned and the cameras blinked back to life, the prison administration tried to piece together what occurred. But with whole sections unrecorded, with dozens of stories contradicting one another, and with inmates bound by silence and gang code, much of that night lives only in the memories of the men who survived it. Some say plans were made. Some say deals were struck. Some say certain men earned their place in prison legend on that night alone. Others say something darker happened, something that never made it into any official report. What we do know is this: Corcoran was never the same after the blackout. Policies changed. Security tightened. Doors were reinforced. Procedures rewritten. But the inmates who lived through it, the officers who fought through it, and the state that watched the headlines erupt in the days after, they all understood one thing. When the lights go out in a prison like Corcoran, you don't get chaos. You get truth. And truth is always violent. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of the darkest nights in California prison history. If you want more real, unfiltered stories from inside the world's most dangerous prisons, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling us what story you want next. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, some places don't sleep, even when the lights do.